On this episode of Below the Surface, Scott and I welcome John Loucaides, Senior Vice President of Strategy here at Eclipseum, to talk about protecting the federal supply chain.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 14, the Firmware and Supply Chain podcast. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipseum by visiting eclipseum.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling the Digital Supply Chain, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can also sign up for a demo. All of that at eclipseum.com/go. Scott, welcome to the show today. How are you, my friend?
Good, Paul. Thank you for having us. As always, I'm so excited to have John on the show. I've learned so much from him in the last 3 years. It's just always one of those things you walk in a room and you're enlightened by some kind of fact or some kind of wisdom from John. So for me, this is a very special episode.
Yeah, it's special for me too. Hey, John.
You guys are making it hard for me now. I gotta live up to that.
That's the idea.
John is the reason why I'm here. So, I mean, you can blame John for that. But
I'm good with that.
John,
that works for me.
Right? We had a long history and learned about Eclipseum a while ago, and John was the liaison between Security Weekly and Eclipseum a few years ago. And I've been working here for over a year and really loving it. And John is just amazing on all fronts, John. So I don't think you need any other introduction than that. How about that?
Well, thank you. I do think we're doing something pretty cool here. We're getting into an area that just doesn't get enough attention, and we do this to ourselves, when we try to make things easy. But it's not necessarily something that can't be done. It's not like it's impossible, intractable. And that's what I kind of set out to do here. And I'm really glad that I'm finding people like you guys who actually want to do it with me.
Yeah. No, it's been a lot of fun. And in your role at Eclipseum, John, you spend a lot of time on what we call like the federal side. So working with the U.S. government and military in general, correct?
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, I had some background with them in the beginning. So it was one of those, I used to live in the DC area, and then I actually ended up moving back to the DC area, and it just sort of fit, and somebody needed to do it. So I started it. Now we got a whole team there, and we were doing all sorts of stuff, but that took a few years.
Yeah, no, it's good. And it's interesting over the years as I've watched how the U.S. federal government in general has been communicating, treating, and changing how they look at the supply chain, and just how much that what sparked the whole thing of the U.S. federal government really getting into supply chain security. Was it SolarWinds, or are there other events that led up to that?
I think that's there's never just one thing. Certainly SolarWinds did a lot, and everybody that I talked to probably had something related to SolarWinds that they had to drop everything and deal with. When I look at the context around it, though, that didn't just happen by itself. You were already getting numerous reports about supply chain issues. One of them, even in say 2019, was this ICT supply chain security paper that came out and basically highlighted, we've got all of this software that you're not seeing because it's embedded into a device, and that's everywhere. And I think, when we did some work with CISA, they started, getting interested in the same thing. This is an area where everybody has known for decades that we have a huge attack surface that nobody sees. And I think, while we're distracted by all sorts of other things, that's fine. We just sort of accept it. But what has been happening is that it's actually been coming up more. And I think over the years, you start off with, some reports that say this. You start getting things like an executive order, and you're saying, wait a minute, maybe I should really pay attention to this. And then you get national strategy and implementation plans, and suddenly, oh, I guess this is our thing. And I was just talking to somebody yesterday, they basically saying, okay, well, my next priority is supply chain, because all of this stuff just started materializing, and that's what I have to do now.
It's really interesting to think about supply chain threats, attacks in general being below the surface, because it's not just the hardware, it's not just firmware, but it's other software as well that really, and you mentioned it in kind of your opening monologue, if you will, John, that these issues tend to go below the surface. They tend to go unnoticed. If we looked at Log4j or Move It, or you go down to device drivers, then to firmware, and then to hardware, like all of it doesn't matter where it is. They kind of fall, if you're not paying attention to it, they can easily be outside of your visible surface.
One of the things I like to bring up when I talk about like what is a supply chain attack is that that's exactly how it's supposed to work. You're not supposed to have to pay attention to it. We designed systems specifically so that you don't have to figure this stuff out. The corollary to that is that you have no insight into it and you lose transparency. And I think we accepted that implicitly without thinking about it. If we had thought about it, it's not that you really want it to be completely opaque. You want it to be something that you have at least a verification capability, something that says, yeah, it's okay. Maybe a health check, if you will, but it's one of those things that I don't need to know all the details, but I need to know it's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Scott?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer your first question too. With my experience with DoD, about 17 years doing cyber for DoD, we've been worried about supply chain almost since I started in early 2000s, post 9/11, et cetera. And the first thing I came across was a set of hard drives, I won't mention the manufacturer, that specifically ended up in DoD data centers. And at the time, DoD was the largest buyer of the highest capacity hard drives. I think at that time, they're like 500 gigs or something, right? They're really big back then. And only those models, right? Only those models destined for this procurement contract with that size were phoning home to our friends in China. And I've seen it too in satellite programs where a certain switch manufacturer, at that time I was liaison to NSA. So it was like a one-way relationship where I flowed what I knew to them and I didn't learn anything back, which is common. And the only thing we had to deal with supply chain was like provenance and due diligence and looking at the company's background and their developers and who funds them and where they're located. And that was like the best insight we had to, I'll call it the firmware, everything below that surface Paul's talking about, to gain some degree of confidence that we're not bringing in some backdoor, some remote capacity, or at that time we worried about things like ticking time bombs where under a certain condition it would just stop working. And that was the best gauge that we had. And if you fast forward to today, and John can speak to this, now we actually have the ability to see underneath that surface, and so do the attackers, right? So it's not just the defenders are finally gaining that advantage, but the attackers have kind of had that advantage before we've had it. And I think that's kind of what's driving all this, is that they've realized, hey, I can go from the OS down to firmware, or conversely, the firmware up to the OS. I can come from the supply chain, or it can come from a spear phishing email and go down to the UEFI, the BIOS, on a motherboard. And that kind of breaks a lot of people's kind of paradigm or implicit assumptive trust model that they've always had about what the OS is compared to the device.
Yeah, and I think what we've... Go ahead, John.
Just what you just said, Scott, is maybe the crux of what's changed or what's changing. I don't think we're done yet, but if you look at maybe a lot of the way a lot of companies sort of see the supply chain, a lot of it is about risk transference, right? Like I don't. This isn't my responsibility. This is my supplier's responsibility. They take care of it, and if something goes wrong, I'm going to send it to them, and they will deal with it. And that's fine, except that I think it leads us into this situation where we don't know anything, and that's not good for anybody. And we're figuring that out. As a result of figuring that out, we're getting a lot of the government sort of policy changes that are moving some of this responsibility onto suppliers and onto developers. So just take software for a quick example. There's attestations with the SSDF that are saying now, I am telling you that I'm signing a thing that says that I actually did do all of these things, and I am sure that they got done. That is, I think, just an example of where we're trying to move some of the responsibilities away from the end user who has no real control over this and back onto the supplier or the developer or the integrator.
I think that we can't run under the assumption that everything that we acquire is secure when it's delivered to us. Because I hear different forms of this argument like, well, isn't it the manufacturer or upstream suppliers, however many there are, isn't it their responsibility to make sure what I receive is secure? And that's never the case. Maybe it's the case the day you receive it, but as soon as you receive it, there's other variables that you can't control that could lead to that device being insecure. And I think it's a shared model of responsibility for securing the supply chain. Yes, it's both the suppliers' roles and responsibilities, but the consumers also we have to verify and then trust, right? And continue to do that for the life cycle of whatever we're implementing or purchasing.
That's a really good point that you're making there, because it's not just one or just the other, right? We traditionally have sort of put everything on the last guy in line. It's the hot potato, and whoever's stuck at the end holding it is the one who has to deal with all the problems. And that's not really fair. That's not really right. That's not going to work. That I think is what they're trying to reset here by pushing some things back earlier in line. But if you think about what's actually needed, that last person still has a job. They have to actually figure out whether or not what they have is okay, and they have to keep it being okay. But they can't do that job if they don't have certain information. And that's where, there's been a lot of SBOM stuff, right? There's been a lot of SSDF is another one. But I see this as a transparency problem. And what I'm finding really interesting or fun is that the National Cybersecurity Strategy stuff actually uses the term system transparency. And I'm like, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That is the thing that is needed.
Yeah, and I think there's two things, which is really interesting, that when I start piecing this together based on conversations that I've had. And so that is, I have to know what's in the thing that I'm getting, and that's part of the transparency that you're talking about, John. I need some kind of SBOM. I got to know what the components are. That's step one. But I also need assurances that not only I know what's inside of it, but that someone didn't do something ridiculously stupid security-wise before it got to me, right? Like, let's minimize that. I'm not going to say it's going to stop, right? And so, but some of the examples of regulation helping this is, so you get the country of France going, when we acquire computers, they have to meet this minimum standard for firmware security because we don't want to get a computer with manufacturing mode. That's bad as an example. So we're going to get ahead of that problem. You have the FDA saying, look, can't be security vulnerabilities in a product that we're going to approve for use on people for health and safety reasons, right? You've got Canada saying you can't sell a car here in Canada if it doesn't have an immobilizer, because that is not just a monetary risk, but also a health and safety risk as well. And I see certain, and I think, John, you can elaborate more on this. In the three examples that I gave, the U.S. federal government is moving in that same direction, where regulation, like I'm a grown-up now, and I find myself saying regulation is really what's going to help us with this problem, right?
It is a funny thing, right? Some of this I do think will help, but to be perfectly honest, like you were pointing out in my earlier, description, you can't just look at one side of this. If you look at the regulation, you say this is the minimum standard, and the minimum standard over time is going to go up. We're going to require more later. That's cool, but it's not the only part of the solution. And so let's take some of your examples, right? We're going to require engine immobilizers. We're going to require that things don't have debug access, manufacturing mode stuff.
Right.
All those things are like motherhood and apple pie. Everybody is like, yeah, that's not supposed to do those things, or it's good to have that. But if that's all we do, there will be no checking. There will be no, so how do you know if it didn't have that? How do you know if it was shipped in manufacturing mode? And that is the problem that kept us from getting into this space 10, 20, 30 years ago. It's the fact that you don't know how to do
validate. We have to validate.
Yeah.
We set a minimum standard for security. We need a way to validate that. Otherwise, it's meaningless.
So, all right. So I'll just lay it out for on the federal side. John and I have been working with a certain client, and one of the things that I got to do is go speak in front of a bunch of folks out on the East Coast. And one of the things I learned in that room that I wasn't aware of prior is that, if you think about mutually assured destruction in the context of DoD, of course, in the 80s, et cetera, the DoDs now, and not just us, other departments of defense and other nation states are worried about something else called mutually unassured destruction. And what MUD is the concept that when you hit the big red button, the damn thing doesn't work. And if you think about the DoD, we've been calling cyber this thing like cyber mission assurance, the ability to assure that when it's time to perform an action, that it works. And now the DoD is stepping back and saying, I'm getting 5G chips from the East. I'm not sure when I hit the button. Russia's worried about IT sanctions. Now, they don't have all the technology they've traditionally needed to build their weapons. If they hit the button, do they know if it'll work? They don't. North Korea, same thing. Like they have failed launches all the time. The DoD is genuinely concerned about the idea that you get this device and you have all these OS level security and STIGs and everything else applied to the OS and the applications and everything above, but there's not been the proper due diligence and, to John's point, the assurance that you can check that and know that when you press the button, something will work. And I think that's the largest driver I learned of, and I'm observing in the DoD space especially, is we need to know that we know. And that's that check and balance, that's that audit, that's that litmus. And unless you have that, you have no way to enable a business process to say, we're spot checking these 10,000 devices, and we're finding that 5% of them have a firmware drift that's unexplainable that we didn't initiate. That's a problem, right? That's unassurance. That's mutually unassured destruction, right? So I think that's what we're seeing in the DoD as a primary driver. There's a lot of other drivers as well, things like performance, and if there's a bug in firmware that can fail. And the other aspect the DoD is worried about now are all these over-the-air updates that can push firmware updates to 5G devices that are spread throughout the entire federal government and critical infrastructure. And all of that's firmware and underneath the surface.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that I think John was mentioning too, that your job is not done. Like even if you can know what's inside the thing you bought, validate it to a certain minimum security standard, it changes, right? It gets updates, and now you start the process all over again.
And now that means that you have to have a way of checking that you're up to date. It means that you have to have a way of checking that the thing that you bought that includes 10 other things is also up to date. And those 10 other things are up to date. And I think this is the opacity problem. This is that transparency issue that rears its ugly head. And a bunch of times, if you're CISA and you have that binding operational directive, and you're maintaining a list of CVEs that are known to be exploited. And, I mean, this is, again, almost motherhood and apple pie stuff. This is like, clearly I want the whole federal government to actually fix the things that they know are being exploited, right?
Right.
Maybe prioritize that. That's what they're trying to do, but you can't do that if you don't have a way of detecting what's there. And that's what I think that the problem is turning into. If you play that out a few more steps, you have that problem in everything, and you have that problem in every
you have that problem
component and every
in your
subcomponent.
owl, in the owl that's sitting in your conference room. That was
probably like 100 different things in it, right?
Yeah, so there's the latest thing that was added to the CISA KEV, the known exploited vulnerabilities list. I think the most recent thing, since we're pre-recording this, so it's the most recent thing we know of right now, are I think it was 4 CVEs that were for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth related vulnerabilities that require an attacker be in proximity, which is crazy. Which means if it's in the KEV, it's known to be exploited. So someone observed this attack. Now, I'd love to get the details on it. I don't think we'll may not get the details.
That's the fun one.
I want to know the details.
Who did that?
Right, we think of our adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, as being really far away and attacking us remotely over the internet. But this is clearly a case where someone was in some physical proximity, right? Which is, I think, kind of scary. And taking advantage of hardware and firmware vulnerabilities in a conference device in this case.
Right, and it's the sort of thing that exactly fits the bill of what we're talking about here, right? It's the firmware of some subcomponent that's put into a lot of different things, including random stuff that you have for, doing meetings in a conference room.
Right.
I think there's an interesting piece to that as well, with respect to, why you go after that sort of thing. And I do look at there being, different goals, right? We talked before about, why do you attack firmware? There are different reasons: persistence and stealth, bypassing security features, disruption or destruction of stuff. If you look at why do you attack something that's a proximity issue, what comes to my mind, and I imagine that Scott is going to be similar for you, is air gap jumping, right? Anything that's going to be, not connected on the same network in a normal way, maybe we can come near it and get at it, right? And I think, as you play this out multiple steps, it starts to look like it's intractable. It starts to be, oh my gosh, everything is made up of 100 more things, including those 100 things. So we're going to be swamped. But if you have to go through them all manually and you have to learn what all those things are and how they work, you're absolutely going to be swamped. There's no chance. That's where tools come in, and that's where actual transparency is needed, so that one person can go figure that out and you just run the tool.
Yeah, and tools help, but I think you reduce your attack surface if you have those minimum standards that when it's configured and delivered, it's in much better shape. So you're at a starting point that gives you you're at an advantage rather than a disadvantage, right? There's no regulation. Anyone can deliver anything, and it has a laundry list of issues, right? You're going to be overwhelmed. But let's get that to a more manageable state. Then we can do what you said, John, right? Use tools and be a lot more effective.
Well, I'll say too, There's this notion that we have vulnerabilities and then we have backdoors and implants. And these are like supply chain things that come up all the time. And in fact, Eclipseums marketees will tell you we worry about threats and vulnerabilities below the surface, right? But I'll tell you, even from experience supporting DoD for a long time, I've often made the argument to even an admiral eye to eye that from a mission assurance perspective or a risk or an impact scenario perspective, there really isn't too much difference between an RCE vulnerability giving you root on a device labeled as a quote unquote vulnerability and a backdoor that an adversary knows is there and is planted there maliciously preemptively. From a risk perspective, and this is a debate I have over beers, but also eye to eye with an admiral. And I've pretty much held this line most of my career when I kind of had this realization that, especially when it comes to supply chain threats, it doesn't matter whether it's a vulnerability or a backdoor. It really does not matter to the enterprise. It doesn't matter to safety and uptime and OT environments, those air gap scenarios. It doesn't matter from an impact scenario, tabletopping, DRP planning perspective. It just doesn't matter. But the fact is, there are a tremendous number of RCE, what we call Cat 1 vulnerabilities in the DoD parlance, CVS 10 9.8 scoring vulnerabilities that are giving attackers complete control over the device at the root level, at the OS level of that device. And that's like just as bad or perhaps worse than a backdoor, because a backdoor, one adversary knows about it. A vulnerability like an RCE, the second it's out, the second a POC is out, the whole internet is hitting that thing. This is why Russia has that apparatus that we discovered through the Vulcan leaks that literally continuously scans the entire internet at a cyclic rate, looking for vulnerabilities, finding persistence on devices, and waiting to use that persistence when it aligns to the mission objective. And they're just able to hit these things continuously. So arguably, these CVSS 9.8 RCE vulns on externally facing devices, or even the air gap devices that John's talking about, because there's no such thing as an actual air gap these days. There's usually a damn device that sits between some layer of the Purdue model and an OT environment. And that device are the things that the hackers that hit Colonial Pipeline, the Cisco ASAs, were able to exploit to jump air gaps, right? I feel like we just need to wake up and be real with ourselves that we have a tremendous IT supply chain cyber problem, and it doesn't really matter whether it's vulnerable or it's maliciously implanted. You have to be able to see, to John's point, and know that you have a vulnerability that gives an actor root control over that device, and you have to be able to manage that risk.
And manage it over time too. It's I think a nice segue into the life cycle of these things, right? We talked about getting ahead of it. Yeah. We talked about when it's delivered, but you're going to have that device for X amount of time, right? Google has just said they're going to do security updates for Chromebooks for 10 years, which is amazing. If you try and put that on other manufacturers, such as Microsoft or Intel, they have a much larger ecosystem than Google does with just Chromebooks, right?
Yeah.
And so it's harder to maintain these things over time. So, John, how do we manage the life cycle of these vulnerabilities and exposures that can live through supply chains, vulnerabilities or backdoors over time?
I do think that it's important that we are able to see things, and that's like that first step. But like you're saying, okay, I know. What am I going to do about it? And
yeah, now there's no update. Now there's no update for it. Now what do I do?
Exactly. And that happens. And it happens actually a lot more than we probably realize, because we're not looking at those. One of the things that being at Eclipseum is sort of, I have a weird sense of humor. So for me, this is fun. But it's interesting to see just how often updates, the latest update, does not include updates that it should have had. Like you package 10 different subcomponents into a thing, and you updated one of them, and that's cool. Or maybe you added some new software and then fixed something over there. But those 10 things didn't get updated, even in your latest package. And that is what we're really getting at here, because that's what causes your owl to be remotely exploitable through some, physically close proximity sort of attack vector. In a lot of these sort of embedded multiple libraries or pieces of software in a thing cases, you need, as the end user, both to be able to know that this is happening, but also, something tangible you can do about it. Sometimes that's just as turning things off, right? If you can configure it to go away, cool. But again, this all comes down to transparency. At some point, if it's a black box to you, and that's all you know, you're going to have a lot of troubles with this. And that's the situation we're currently in. So I personally believe
John,
that it's about...
You were relating this to microcode updates on your CPU. And there's been a series of micro-architectural vulnerabilities. Is that the right way to phrase that? And so I think it's really interesting in the context of what we're just talking about, getting those updates is important. How do you know that you got that update? And how do you know that update was effective at mitigating the exploitation? Now, having a processor that's vulnerable to Zenbleed, I checked that because I think Zenbleed is a really, really easily exploitable micro-architectural vulnerability. And I can't go into the detail that some can on that, but what I've gleaned is in experience, I was like, wow, I compiled the binary and I ran it, and hey, look, it's contents of memory showing up on my screen. Like it's strings showing up on my screen. Like that's pretty neat.
It's not always that easy, but you were able to do it, and it didn't take you 100 tries. And you know what else it doesn't require of you? You didn't have to figure out what all the processor IP cores are doing, right? You didn't need to really understand that. You got to do the script kiddie thing and just like download stuff, run stuff, and hey, look, that worked. That happens so much more than we give it credit for. And I think what makes this really worse is the fact that we don't see, we don't see inside, say, your BIOS updates. And your BIOS updates are supposed to package that microcode. And if they don't, you can be on the latest BIOS update. You can think that you got everything up to date, and that exact, piece of code will just work, just like it did on your system. Now, I don't know if your system actually had an update that fixed this. Did it?
It did. So actually, the Linux operating system that I run, I think it used, I'm not sure what the mechanism was, whether it was the firmware package or was some other mechanism.
You can install microcode updates from the OS as well. I know Linux package.
Yeah, and Linux distributions vary exactly how they do that, right? And so it did come down, and then all of a sudden my compiled exploit, I'm like, oh, it doesn't work anymore. It's like,
nice.
That's amazing. But I validated that, right? I mean, in the context of what we were talking about in terms of compliance and constantly validating and then trusting, like I'm probably the exception to, the rule where people actually tested to make sure that, hey, did I get that microcode update? And does the exploit really not work anymore? Right.
You are the exception to the rule.
Yes.
You certainly are, but that actually does give you a good example of where this works well, I think. It works well both because you were able to do the tests. So it's transparent enough that you can do it. Whether you do it or not, you can. And the other thing that happened is, at least in whatever Linux distro you're on, they clearly identified an update that clearly fixes this issue, right? Mm-hmm. And that's great. Why didn't your BIOS manufacturer do that? Why didn't your OEM do that? Like all of these other places, you could have made the same sort of argument. Lucky for you, your OS did it. If you were on a different OS, didn't package that update, well, what happens?
If my motherboard came from a manufacturer whose 3-letter acronym begins with M and I probably wouldn't have got it from them, in my experience.
Well, if it began with G and ended with byte, You might
Right.
have some different, interesting module that downloads whatever and runs whatever. So, you can pick whatever and you probably have problems. But I
John,
think this is what we're trying to solve. We're trying to make it
Yeah.
so that you can see this. And if you can, I think the incentives are set up so that this will get better. But if you can't see it, this goes on forever.
John, can
Right.
I ask you a question? I have a question for John. Okay, so I think most of the listeners here, as they sit here, if you ask them the question, do you know of all of your devices, let's just focus on x86 for fun. Of all of your devices, which ones have BIOS BIOS write enable protection disabled or enabled? Do they have secure boot enabled? Some of the core features that we see APTs as well as criminal groups go after en masse, pretty much. I don't think even people know those basic configurations. And the other aspect I want to ask you about from your perspective is there's this notion that you can look on, let's say, Microsoft, and it'll tell you if secure boot is enabled, right? And so I can use Microsoft to tell me at an OS level what the hardware and the BIOS are actually doing, what their version is, whether they're securely configured, like those settings I just mentioned. But there's a rub there, right? So tell us more. I don't want to I'm obviously bump set spiking here, and I know the answer, but I want to hear from your perspective. Since you've been doing this for so long, and you've got a lot of field experience with customers doing this as well. First of all, what percentage of people do you think even know their basic x86 secure configuration settings and firmware updates? And then secondly, can you trust the OS, the way the OS implements this, to tell you for sure, is the OS able to actually inspect those binaries and heuristically analyze them to know that it knows, right? Verify, then trust. You can approach it from zero trust, however you want to answer. But what's your take on both those questions?
Those are some interesting questions. And before I actually give you a direct answer, I think you've kind of asked for it. So you're going to get story time. And story time involves me and Yuri and Alex and a bunch of the folks on the research team back when I started at Intel. And the funny part is that even at that time, so let's go back a little before that. I think it was 2011, 2010 when NIST put out 800.147, which is basically saying we need signed BIOS, and we can't just let random people rewrite firmware. And there was stuff before that, but that was a pretty clear everybody should do this kind of activity. It got a lot of the industry moving, and they did stuff. What undermined all of that was the settings that you were talking about, things like BIOS write protection, or even some more complicated stuff. But even something that basic of just disable writes, at least. It was shocking to me how often you would see systems where that was not protected. And in particular, they would claim compliance with 800.147 and they would check signatures. But doing that is completely irrelevant if I can just rewrite anything anytime I want. So great, I'm so glad that you added these crypto algorithms to your firmware. It doesn't mean anything. That kind of bugged me for a while. So we released ChipSec at some point with checks for that. And, we went and coordinated this with all the manufacturers. And shockingly, after that, you didn't see that as often. It was noticeably different. This is actually one of the first lessons for me that led to Eclipseum, which said, if you can see it and you can check it and you get a big red fail thing somewhere, people actually respond to that. And so that's kind of what we're doing by actually making those settings visible to everybody, is that you are capable of checking something that you probably didn't know about. And now that gets into your question, right? You, as normal computer users, you don't go reading data sheets. If you do, come work for Eclipseum. But if you're normal, like everyone else, then you're not going to do that. You don't want to know how this works, and it's not actually something you're supposed to have to know. But what you are supposed to know is whether or not you've securely configured a system, and whether it's up to date, and whether it is what it says it is. And those things are things that are automatable. And now getting into your second question about like how an operating system does it, most of the time people don't like redundancy when they're developing something. They don't like to do this 2 or 3 different ways. So they pick whatever works best for them for, different criteria, trade-offs go here. But they pick something and they do that one thing. And the problem when you're getting into things like zero trust, or you're getting into deciding whether or not to accept what somebody told you, is that you really do want to cross-check. And so Eclipseum is actually doing multiple checks in multiple different places, any one of which the operating system might be telling you. And I'm sure we'll actually ask the operating system too and get whatever it's going to tell us. But then we'll also go and poke at some hardware and see what that tells us too. It's sort of that cross-checking nature of zero trust, where if that's true, then this will also be true. Like, if I actually disabled writes, then when I try to write to it, I should not, be successful. Not to say that that's exactly the way that you should check these things, but the idea is that you're going to cross-check.
It's interesting what I've really kind of changed my thinking about what some of the things we do, especially evangelizing some of these issues, right? Below the operating system, it's very easy to ignore or misunderstand what some of these settings and vulnerabilities do, or the impact that they can have, right? And the example I have is someone wrote an article and they were referring to the DBX as firmware, and they called it DBX firmware. Like, well, no, the DBX isn't firmware. It's really just like a bunch of data that's stored in a variable that is used by firmware. It's very important to validate or invalidate software for your operating system. So they completely misunderstood, like missed the entire point. And for them to understand the supply chain threats and vulnerabilities and do something about it, I think we have to do a better job, in fact, of explaining that and evangelizing that to a larger audience, right? Because a lot of those things below the operating system are difficult to understand and contextualize. But go above the operating
that's
system.
Why I like talking to you guys about this stuff.
But
no
even
one
like
understands this.
Above the operating system, I find myself now labeling it as like Paul's esoteric Linux thing that no one should care about, but I'm going to torch you with it on the podcast anyway, kind of things, right? So in Ubuntu recently, if you were using Subiquity to automate your Ubuntu installs for a certain period of time, it put in your sources.list the mirror for your security updates as like a mirror, not as security.ubuntu.com. That actually could have grave security implications. It could mean your updates are being delayed longer than they are, so it's something you should fix. But again, it's like those little esoteric things that we may not think to check for in the context of validating secure, supply chains. But if you don't do it, it could have that security impact, right? And I've like a lot of these different examples. There was a Debian package being distributed on, it was like free open source software.org. I don't know if you guys saw that story, but certain users that downloaded a certain package from that website actually got malware in a malicious.deb package.
Been hearing about that a lot recently.
Right? And they were actually targeting, they weren't sure exactly what the target profile was, but it wasn't everyone. It was a certain profile. And I think the goal there was cryptocurrency mining or stealing in some capacity. So, was that North Korea? It could have been, but so they had a specific profile. But if you weren't looking, like that's another weird esoteric, supply chain issue.
Well, that's the Linux side. On the Windows side, when Jesse and Mickey presented at DEF CON 30 the year before last, on the demo they did, they showed Microsoft showing everything totally working. BitLocker, secure boot enabled,
Correct. Yes.
PPM,
Yes.
all that stuff. But the damn thing had a malicious bootloader. And you know, it's one of those things where you just can't, if you have this kind of problem, if it's manifested, if it's after the fact or right of boom, so to speak, you need something that will tell you you've got a malicious bootloader, and that has to be independent of the operating system, right? In your case, Paul, it's like a lot of manual effort and research on your part, and kind of a fixation on making sure your Linux box is as secure as it can be. But there's ways to do this and automate too, like John was saying.
but it's interesting. So you hit on. I don't want to pitch the product, but having used our product, there's two features that I really like, and one is the baselining, where you can say, "Hey, take a snapshot of my bootloader and tell me if it changes." And if it changes, send me an alert, because if that didn't coincide with an operating system update, it could be someone tampered with it. And I may not know that otherwise, to your point, Scott. Windows could be telling me that everything is hunky-dory, but it's really not. So we need that extra checks and balances.
Absolutely.
The other feature is on your network devices. I know Nate Warfield and company on our research team has worked on ways to identify configuration that could be indicative of an attacker that got on your network device, like your firewall. Like, hey, your firewall rules changed, and they changed in such a way that it's allowing way more stuff than it was before, so you might want to look into that, because you could have been compromised by the latest Citrix, Fortinet, F5, Cisco. I mean, you know, I'm not going to pick on any one vendor, because we all live in glass houses, right? We all make software, and all software has vulnerabilities.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
But it's that functionality that, like, of tell me something's not right, even though I may not immediately realize that through other mechanisms.
That's the whole point of these tools, in a sense, right? You can't know everything. If you're trying to just know everything, good luck. It's going to be a long road. And what this allows you to do is to, you know, inherit from things other people have learned. I mean, in my career, that's been most of what I did. All these things that it's not, you guys think that I know, and I'm really, I didn't make this stuff up. I learned it from somebody else. And there's all of this. If you can't do that, I don't know how you're going to get this job done, right? There's no operationally feasible, you know, mechanism other than to automate some of this. And so, I think you hit on something really interesting to me, because you hit on the way that we cross-check. We don't just look at a version number, right? We don't just look at a setting. And do we do both of those things? Yes, of course we do. But we try and cross-check. We try and say, well, if that's true, then this should be true as well. And when those things start to not match anymore, that's where the heuristics start to fire and say, okay, that's possible, but it seems really unlikely that you would have ever done that.
Right.
Yeah,
we were talking about how most of us that work in security, probably all of us that work in security, to a certain extent, are detectives and puzzle solvers, right?
Right.
It feels like we're automating some of that detective work and puzzle solving, and allowing other people to reach those conclusions by looking at a number of different factors. But like, we as security people, like, wait, why in our kids, most likely across the board, probably really hate that. My teenager hates the fact that I'm like really good at. He's like, you make a great detective, Dad, because you can't get away with anything. Right? I'm always like, well, that's true. I gotta go cross-reference that camera, you know, with that camera, and like, you just like give up at that point, right? But I like automating some of that detective work.
Yeah, I think, John, too, you know, to your point, most of these campaigns that do manifest in the wild, they're not discovered for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So these are what we call long tail campaigns with long tail persistence. And it's why those actors go to the firmwares, because they're not detected. And the dad, to use Paul's analogy, we're usually like concerned with the low-hanging fruit, like how many cookies are still in the cookie jar, right? What did the front door camera say, right? But when it comes to firmware, it's almost like you have this person living under your house in a cave that you've never even thought to look of. You never even would have imagined that could be possible. And so you're not looking there by default because you're so overwhelmed with malware and alerts and all these other things in the front door and the cookie jar. And I think that's where Eclipseum comes in. It's like, look, I'm going to tell you what's under your house. I'm going to tell you what kind of ogre that is, how long they've been there, and what they can do. And then I'm going to show you how to fix it too. I mean, that's the other half of this is like, okay, you showed me there's an ogre under my house. Great. What am I supposed to do about it? Well, boom, there's your link to the firmware update that fixes this. Go. Right. And you can prioritize all that. I mean, I'm going to get on a soapbox if I don't shut up, but I think your analogy is hilarious and totally on point, Paul.
Yeah, you reminded me of another analogy of, I think it happened here in Rhode Island, where this couple lived inside the parking garage for like a year and no one noticed. You just reminded me of that. Right.
Yeah.
But that's the analogy is over to what we do is attackers, maintaining that persistence that is below the surface and below visibility. So
I got to just add one more part to the analogy. The same ogre underneath your house also can knock out the entire foundation and burn your house down at the flick of a switch. Right. And people don't realize that you can go from espionage for 3 years and all of a sudden you have the political will to pull the switch to destroy the critical device. You can do that too, right? So from an impact perspective, people need to think about this analogy.
So John, just in closing thoughts, if you could maybe summarize some of the initiatives you've got going on here at Eclipseum that you can talk about.
Great. So a lot of, I always think about what we're doing at Eclipseum, sort of expanding in breadth and depth. And on the depth side, there's always more of those heuristics. I'd like to do a shout out to our detection teams. We've got some folks who are doing some interesting static analysis and heuristics. We've got folks that are looking at ways to add sort of rules to detect some of these ongoing attack campaigns, particularly the ones targeting appliances and network devices. So that's sort of a ongoing, never going to stop, constantly going deeper into different things. The other one is in breadth, as you start to look at how we can cover integrity and risk on different types of devices. And so as you get into some of the things that we've been adding are related to some of the manufacturers' technologies that are built in. So we've been adding some things related to the supply chain verification that a manufacturer offers. You're going to start seeing more of that as we start to, really leverage a lot of these partnerships. But it kind of comes back to a lot of what we were talking about, where this is not a one-man show kind of the solution. No one person is going to go learn everything and do everything. And at Eclipseum, I think one of the fun things for us is that we get to sort of be in the center and pull them all together and put it in a place and in a form that you as an end user can actually just see the result. And you don't have to learn everything about it right up until the point where you actually have a problem. And then you might want to know. But all these things are just too many to put together with just one person. So that's an ongoing activity, and a lot of people are using it in different places with different use cases. I think earlier you mentioned the DigitalOcean case study. We've got some folks doing it in supply chain where when they receive equipment, they do a verification. So a lot of those things are also ongoing, where you've got use cases, breadth, and depth.
John, thank you so much for coming on Below the Surface. Scott, thank you as always. That will conclude this episode. See everyone next time.